I am Lieutenant Colonel Erica Daniels, 33 years old, an officer in the United States Air Force. But today, standing outside my brother's medal ceremony at Fort Bragg, I am invisible. I watch my family walk past, my father, a retired Army colonel, giving my brother Jason a proud clap on the shoulder as he smirks at my predicament with the gate guard. "Sorry, ma'am, you're not on the list." They don't know that the desk job daughter they've dismissed for 15 years is the very reason generals salute first. They don't know that my name is on a different list tonight, one that will be read aloud from the main stage. The drive to Fort Bragg, a fortress of Army green, had been filled with a foolish sliver of hope, but the cold truth hit me right at the security checkpoint. Have you ever been made to feel like a stranger by your own family? Excluded from the very moments you should have been a part of? If you know the pain of being overlooked by those who should see you most, like this story and follow along, because you are about to witness how 15 years of silent strength is finally given a voice. The humid North Carolina air, thick with the scent of pine and discipline, felt alien as I pulled into the parking lot of Fort Bragg. This was Army country, a world away from the sterile, data-driven environment of the Air Force I called home. I saw them standing near the entrance, my family. Taking a deep breath, I plastered on a hopeful smile, a foolish attempt to bridge the chasm that had grown between us. It was useless. My father, resplendent in his retired colonel's uniform, offered a curt nod, his eyes sweeping past me as if I were just part of the landscape. My mother fussed over Jason's tie, her back turned to me. Then came my brother, the star of the day. Brushing past me so closely his shoulder nearly knocked me off balance. "Well, look who it is," he drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "I didn't think you Air Force types knew how to find Fort Bragg." The silence that followed from my parents was a ringing endorsement of his cruelty. It was a familiar ache, but today it felt sharper, more deliberate. I pushed it down and walked towards the security checkpoint, my heart a tight knot in my chest. I handed my ID to the young guard, a private with earnest eyes. He scanned his clipboard, frowned, scanned it again. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with professional regret. "I don't see an Erica Daniels on the Daniels family guest list." My breath caught. I could feel Jason watching from a few feet away, enjoying the show. Instead of stepping in, he let the silence hang in the air before strolling over. The picture of casual authority. He leaned towards the guard, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "It's probably just a mix-up," he said, shrugging. "She's just a distant cousin, not that important." A distant cousin. The words sliced through me, clean and cold. It wasn't an oversight. It was a public execution of my identity. He had erased me, disowned me with 3 casual words, and my parents stood by, their faces impassive, complicit in their silence. The world seemed to tilt, the sounds of the bass fading into a dull roar in my ears. I was frozen, pinned by the weight of their collective betrayal. Just then, my mother approached. For a wild, stupid second, I thought she was coming to fix it, to scold Jason, to pull me into the fold. But her touch was not one of comfort. Her fingers dug into my elbow, her manicured nails a sharp warning. "Erica," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss, meant only for me. "Don't make a scene. This is Jason's day. You should know your place." She didn't need to tell me where my place was. Her eyes, cold and dismissive, pointed to it. Outside, in the shadows, far from the celebrated light of their perfect family. She turned and walked away, rejoining them without a backward glance. Leaving me alone, with the shattered pieces of my hope. I stood there, rooted to the spot, looking through the glass doors at the warm, bustling hall where my family was being celebrated. Out here, the air was cold, but it was nothing compared to the ice that was now forming around my heart. Why could they do this? What had I ever done to become so worthless in their eyes? Standing there in the cold, watching them through the glass, that one question echoed in the hollow space inside my chest. Why? What had I ever done? The truth is, it wasn't one thing. It was everything. It was a lifetime of moments, 1,000 tiny cuts that had bled me of my worth in their eyes long before this final public amputation. My mind drifted back, pulled by the undertow of memory, to the scent of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie in our Fayetteville home. Thanksgiving was always my father's favorite holiday. It was a time for tradition, for family, and for him to hold court at the head of the table. I remember the year I was 17, my acceptance letter to the Air Force Academy with a full scholarship was still crisp in my pocket. I was bursting with pride, waiting for the perfect moment to share my news. As my mother brought out the turkey, golden and glistening, my father raised his glass of bourbon. His eyes, however, were fixed solely on Jason. "A toast," he boomed, his voice filling the room. "To my son, a future soldier who will carry on the Daniels legacy with honor." Everyone cheered. This was my moment, I thought. "Dad, I have some good news too," I began, my voice trembling slightly with excitement. "I got a full scholarship to—" He cut me off, not with malice, but with an indifference that was far more brutal. He waved a dismissive hand. "That's nice, honey. At least you'll have something to do," he said, his focus already shifting. "Now can someone pass the mashed potatoes?" And just like that, my accomplishment, the culmination of years of hard work, was reduced to a side dish on the Thanksgiving table. It was something to pass the time, while Jason's future was the main course, the only thing worthy of a toast. I spent the rest of that dinner pushing cranberry sauce around my plate, the sweet taste turning to ash in my mouth. The deepest cut, however, came not from a public dismissal, but from a private truth I was never meant to hear. I was 20, home from college for Christmas break. The house was quiet, and I was walking past my father's study to get a glass of water when I heard their voices, low and serious. I stopped, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "The house and the bulk of the savings will go to Jason," my father stated, his tone as final as a judge's gavel. "He'll have a family to support, a lineage to continue. Erica, she'll have her government pension. Besides, she chose a different path. She can take care of herself." I waited for my mother to protest, to argue for me, to say something. But all that came from the other side of the door was silence. A heavy, damning silence that was louder than any agreement. I felt the blood drain from my face, a glacial cold seeping into my bones. I was standing in the hallway of the home I grew up in, and I had just been rendered homeless in my own future. They had written me out of their legacy, treating me not as a daughter, but as a settled asset. A line item that had been accounted for and closed. They had written my living will for me, and in it I was left with nothing. The pattern was always the same. Jason was the priority. I was the afterthought. It was never clearer than on the humid June day of my high school graduation. I was the valedictorian. I stood at the podium looking out at a sea of faces, my blue graduation gown sticking to my skin. I searched for my family, my eyes scanning the crowd for the proud faces I so desperately wanted to see. I found my mother sitting alone, a polite, strained smile on her face. Beside her was an empty chair. a gaping, symbolic void. "It's an important Army football game at West Point, honey," she had explained earlier, her voice apologetic but firm. "Your father and Jason couldn't miss it. You understand." But I didn't understand. I couldn't comprehend how my most significant achievement to date could be less important than a meaningless scrimmage. As I delivered my speech about the future, all I could see was that empty chair, a stark monument to my place in their lives. I was the second choice, the disposable commitment, the daughter whose milestones could be sacrificed for the whims of the son. Standing here now, outside Jason's ceremony, the memories swirled together, forming a bitter, undeniable truth. This wasn't a new wound, it was merely the salting of an old one. After all of that, after years of being told in 100 different ways that I wasn't enough, why did I keep trying for so long? Why did a part of me still walk up to that gate, hoping this time, finally, it would be different? That question, why did I keep trying for so long, hung in the air as the memories faded, leaving me standing in the present, outside my brother's ceremony. The truth is, eventually I stopped trying, not at being an officer, but at being their daughter. That break happened when I took my first assignment at the 16th Air Force at Lackland. I packed my life into 2 suitcases and moved to San Antonio, a city that felt as vast and indifferent as the Texas sky above it. I thought distance would be a shield. Instead, it became a magnifying glass for my loneliness. San Antonio greeted me with a blast of dry heat and an overwhelming sense of isolation. To escape the emptiness of my sparsely furnished apartment, I threw myself into my work. The world of cyber warfare was a perfect refuge. It was complex, demanding, and utterly consuming. During the day, my mind was a fortress of algorithms, threat assessments, and encrypted data streams. I was a warrior in a digital trench, and I was good at it. But when the sun set, the silence of my life would roar back. The fortress would crumble, leaving me exposed. More nights than I can count, I found myself driving aimlessly until the fluorescent lights of a 24/7 Whataburger called to me like a lighthouse. I'd sit in a corner booth, the vinyl sticking to my skin, with a #1 combo and a large Dr. Pepper. I'd watch the life unfolding around me. Teenagers laughing, families sharing fries, a young couple holding hands. I was an island, adrift in a sea of human connection I couldn't seem to reach. Texas was supposed to be big, a place to start over, but I had never felt smaller or more lost. The work was my only anchor. The pressure at the 16th was immense. We weren't just pushing paper, we were on the front lines of a new kind of war. One of my first major assignments was tracking a foreign hacking collective that was probing our critical infrastructure. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, played across continents in milliseconds. And I made a mistake. A single minuscule error in a line of code, a misplaced semicolon, created a blind spot. For 3 crucial hours, the hackers vanished. We were flying blind. My superior, Colonel Miller, was an old-school officer cut from the same cloth as my father. He called me into his office. There was no yelling, no outburst. It was worse. He just looked at me, his face a mask of disappointment, and said in a low, measured voice, "Daniels, I knew I shouldn't have put a junior officer on a mission this delicate. Perhaps you're better suited for report analysis." The words hit me like a physical blow. It was my father's voice, my brother's smirk, all of their condescension wrapped in the professional jargon of the military. Better suited for reports. The desk job daughter. For the first time, a terrifying thought took root. What if they were right? What if I had been fooling myself all along? The doubt was a poison, seeping into every part of me, paralyzing my confidence and turning my ambition to dust. That night, I couldn't sleep. The self-loathing was a heavy blanket, suffocating me. I scrolled mindlessly through YouTube on my laptop, searching for anything to quiet the screaming in my head. And then I saw it, a TED Talk titled The Power of Vulnerability by a woman named Brené Brown. I clicked, not expecting much. I listened once, then again. Her words weren't about military strategy or cyber warfare, but they felt more relevant than any briefing I'd ever attended. She spoke of courage, not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to show up and be seen when you have no control over the outcome. She talked about stepping into the arena, knowing you might fail, knowing you might get your ass kicked, but doing it anyway. A specific phrase stuck with me, echoing in the silent apartment. Vulnerability is not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage. It was a revelation, a paradigm shift. All this time, I had seen my hurt, my desperate need for my family's approval, as a weakness. I saw my failure at work as proof of my inadequacy. But Brené Brown was offering a different lens. My vulnerability wasn't a flaw. It was the cost of courage. It was the proof that I was in the arena, fighting a battle no one in my family could even comprehend. I didn't magically feel better. The hurt was still there. But for the first time, it wasn't a source of shame. It was a battle scar. The next morning, I walked into the office before anyone else. I sat down at my terminal, pulled up the failed code, and with a steady hand, I started again. I was still in the arena, and I was done waiting for anyone's permission to fight. The morning after, my late-night epiphany with Brené Brown, I walked into Colonel Miller's office and placed a full report on his desk. It not only detailed my initial error, but also outlined a new, more robust protocol to prevent similar breaches in the future. I had stepped into the arena. His response was a tight, dismissive nod. A week later, I received new orders. I was being reassigned. My heart sank. This was it, the punishment. I was being shuffled off to some forgotten project, a career death sentence for my perceived failure. I packed my desk with a heavy sense of resignation, preparing for another round of proving myself from scratch. The name on my new assignment was Project Silent Sentry. The commanding officer was General Marshall. My blood ran cold. General Samuel Marshall was a legend in the intelligence community, a ghost who had shaped cyber warfare for 2 decades. He was known for being brilliant, demanding, and utterly intolerant of incompetence. This wasn't a punishment, this was a test, and I was sure I was being set up to fail. I walked into my first briefing with General Marshall, feeling like a lamb being led to slaughter. The room was filled with seasoned officers, majors, and colonels who had been in the game for years. The general, a man with a quiet intensity that was more intimidating than any parade ground bark, stood before a complex schematic. He posed a question about multi-layered encryption protocols that silenced the room. It was a theoretical nightmare, a puzzle with no obvious solution. But as the silence stretched, something clicked in my mind. It was a pattern, a vulnerability, hidden in the logic. Before I could second-guess myself, my voice filled the void. Sir, if we rewrote the primary authentication through a quantum-resistant ledger and create a series of cascading honeypots, we could not only block the intrusion, but actively trap and trace the source. The room remained silent. I felt a flush of panic, certain I had overstepped. General Marshall turned his piercing gaze on me. He didn't smile, but his eyes held a flicker of something I had never seen, directed at me before, respect. That, he said, his voice calm but resonant, is the thinking of a strategist, not a coder. Well done, Lieutenant Colonel. He called me by my rank, not my last name. In that moment, for the first time in my professional life, I felt seen, not as a woman, not as a junior officer, not as Colonel Daniels's daughter, but as a mind worthy of its rank. General Marshall had a tradition. Once a month, he'd host a barbecue for his team at his sprawling ranch in the Texas Hill Country. My first invitation felt like a summons. I drove out, expecting a stiff, formal affair. Instead, I found a scene of controlled chaos and genuine camaraderie. The air was thick with the smoky, delicious scent of slow-cooked brisket. Officers in jeans and t-shirts were drinking Shinerbach beer, laughing and throwing a football in the yard. It was relaxed, it was real, and it was utterly terrifying. As I stood awkwardly by the drink cooler, General Marshall approached me, a plate piled high with brisket and potato salad in his hand. He gestured for me to follow him to a quiet corner of the porch, away from the noise. "I read your file, Daniels," he said, getting straight to the point. "And I know who your father is, distinguished career in the Army." He paused, looking out at the vast Texas landscape. "Don't let the shadow of the Army's green dim the light of the Air Force's blue. We fight different wars. Your battlefield doesn't have bullets or bombs, but believe me when I tell you, it is no less critical to the safety of this nation." I was speechless. It was one thing to have my work acknowledged. It was another entirely to have the invisible weight on my shoulders, the constant, crushing comparison to my family's legacy, seen and understood by a man like him. It was a profound, staggering relief, like a pressure valve being released in my soul. I could only nod, my throat tight with an emotion I couldn't name. That day was a turning point. General Marshall's team slowly became my tribe. They were the ones I spent 36-hour stretches with, fueled by cold pizza and stale coffee, chasing digital ghosts through the dark web. They were the ones who saw me at my most stressed and my most focused. There was Mark, a quiet major who always seemed to know when I needed a fresh cup of coffee without me having to ask. There was Maria, a sharp-witted analyst who could make me laugh even when we were facing a critical system breach. They never asked about my family. They didn't care about the Daniels name or the legacy I had supposedly abandoned. They cared about my analysis, my strategies, and whether I had their back in a crisis. They argued with me, challenged me, and respected me. We celebrated silent victories that the world would never know about, our cheers echoing only within the secure walls of our operations center. One evening, after a particularly grueling operation, I drove back to my apartment. I unlocked the door and stepped into the silence. But for the first time, it wasn't a lonely silence. It was peaceful. I looked at my phone, lying on the counter. There were no missed calls from home, no texts demanding my attention. And for the first time, that didn't feel like rejection. It felt like freedom. I was finally starting to understand that family wasn't just about the blood you were born with. It was about the people who chose to stand with you in the trenches. For a few blissful months, my life in San Antonio found a quiet rhythm. The work was demanding, the hours were long, but for the first time, I felt a sense of belonging. The team at Silent Sentry became my anchor. The peaceful silence in my apartment was no longer a symbol of loneliness, but of earned tranquility. I was building a life, my life on my own terms. The constant ache of my family's disapproval had faded to a dull, distant throb. I started to believe, foolishly, that I had finally escaped the gravitational pull of my past. Then one Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in months. Mom. My stomach instantly clenched. I let it ring, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It went to voicemail. A minute later, a text appeared. "Erica, please call me. It's about your father." Against my better judgment, a sliver of hope wedged its way into my carefully constructed defenses. I called back. My mother's voice answered on the first ring, syrupy sweet, and laced with a concern I hadn't heard in years. "Erica, sweetheart, thank you for calling," she began. "Listen, honey, your father is having a small hip surgery next month. It's nothing life-threatening, but you know how he is. He'll need some help around the house. Jason is tied up with field training exercises, and I can't manage it all on my own." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Could you possibly take a few weeks of leave and come home to Fayetteville? Your father misses you terribly. He talks about you all the time." "He misses you." The words were a carefully aimed dart, striking the most vulnerable part of my heart. A part of me, the little girl who had spent a lifetime craving his approval, desperately wanted to believe it. Was this it? The moment they finally needed me, saw me as a daughter again? The conflict was a physical thing, a churning in my gut. My duty as a daughter warred with the hard-won peace I had fought so hard to build. The walls I had erected around myself felt suddenly fragile. But years of disappointment had taught me one thing: caution. A nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that this was too easy, too neat. I ended the call with a non-committal. "Let me check my schedule, Mom. I'll call you back." My hands were shaking slightly as I scrolled through my contacts and found the number for Carol, an old family friend and my mother's gossipy neighbor in Fayetteville. After a few minutes of pleasantries, I steered the conversation. "I heard Dad's having surgery soon. Is everything okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Surgery?" Carol asked, her voice filled with genuine confusion. "Honey, your father is fine. I just saw him out on the golf course yesterday. He did pull a muscle or something, complained about his backswing, but that's it. He's healthy as a horse." Then she dropped the bomb. "Your mother did mention you might be coming home, though, for the big dinner. Jason's girlfriend, Stephanie, her parents are flying in from Connecticut to meet everyone. Your mom has been planning the menu for weeks. She wants everything to be perfect." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. It wasn't a surgery, it was a performance. They didn't need their daughter, they needed a prop. A living, breathing piece of set dressing to complete their picture of a perfect, happy, all-American family for the wealthy in-laws. The emergency was a lie, a guilt trip wrapped in the language of family obligation. The manipulation was so blatant, so deeply cynical, it stole the air from my lungs. It was worse than being ignored, it was being used. I took a few hours to let the cold, hard rage settle into a steely resolve. I knew what I had to do. I dialed my mother's number, my heart calm and steady for the first time all day. "Erica, so have you booked your flight?" she asked, her voice bright with false cheer. "Mom," I said, my tone level and professional. "I won't be able to make it. We have a critical project here at work, and I can't get away." The change was instantaneous. The warmth in her voice evaporated, replaced by an Arctic chill. "A project?" she repeated, the words dripping with disdain. "I see. So your little computer job is more important than your own father." "My little computer job is my career, Mom, and I know Dad isn't having surgery." The silence on the other end was deafening. She had been caught, but there was no apology, no remorse, only fury. "I knew it," she spat, her voice tight with venom. "You've always been selfish, Erica. Always thinking only of yourself. Fine. Stay in Texas with your important career. But don't bother calling this house again." Click. She hung up. I stared at my phone, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. The hope I had foolishly allowed to flicker was now extinguished, leaving behind nothing but the bitter taste of ashes. I had been given a choice, be their puppet or be their enemy. There was no middle ground. Their love was a transaction, and I had just refused to pay the price. Without another thought, I opened my contacts, found her name, and pressed the button. Block this caller. It was a small act, but it felt like a declaration of war. Or perhaps a declaration of independence. After I blocked my mother's number, a strange, profound silence settled over my life. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. There were no more manipulative phone calls, no passive-aggressive emails, no demands disguised as family duty. The peace was real, but it was the fragile peace of a ceasefire, not a victory. I told myself this was better, that I had chosen self-preservation. I had finally set a boundary. But in the quiet moments late at night, a treacherous thought would surface. I hadn't won. I had just run from the fight. I had chosen exile over confrontation. It was in this fragile state of quiet that General Marshall summoned me to his office. The afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting long, stark shadows across the room, mirroring the ambiguity I felt inside. He got straight to the point, a habit of his I'd come to appreciate for its efficiency. "Daniels," he began, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention without needing to be raised. "The Joint Chiefs have authorized the declassification of Operation Silent Sentry. Full public disclosure. The President himself has signed off." My heart, which had been beating at a calm, steady rhythm, began to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. He continued, oblivious to my internal turmoil. "For your leadership and extraordinary heroism in the face of significant national threat, you are being awarded the Air Force Cross." The words hung in the air, seeming to warp the very light in the room. The Air Force Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. It was an honor reserved for legends, for heroes. It was not for people like me. "The ceremony," he went on, "will be a joint event held at Fort Bragg in a few weeks. It's a big deal, a show of inter-service cooperation. A lot of brass will be there." He paused, his gaze sharp and knowing. "I'm aware that your brother is being decorated there on the same day. The question is, Lieutenant Colonel, do you want to attend and accept this medal in person?" He gave me a choice, a terrible, wonderful, impossible choice. My immediate, gut-wrenching instinct was to recoil. No. The word screamed in my mind. Fort Bragg was their turf, their kingdom. The thought of facing my family in that arena, of standing on a stage next to Jason, felt like willingly walking into my own emotional execution. The fragile peace I had so carefully cultivated over the past months felt infinitely more valuable than any piece of metal, no matter how prestigious. I could accept it quietly, later, in a private ceremony. I didn't need the public spectacle. I didn't need their validation. The words, "No thank you, sir, I'd prefer a private ceremony," were on the tip of my tongue. I almost let them escape. I almost chose the safety of the shadows once more. That night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. I lay in bed, the general's words replaying on a loop, a battle raging in my mind. tossing and turning, I finally gave up and reached for my laptop, scrolling mindlessly through Facebook, a digital anesthetic for a restless mind. And that's when I saw it. My sister-in-law, Stephanie, had just posted a new photo an hour ago. It was a professional family portrait, perfectly lit, set against a backdrop of autumnal North Carolina trees, their leaves a blaze of orange and red. There was my father, looking stern and proud in his tweed jacket. My mother smiling serenely, her hand on his arm, and in the center, Jason and a beaming Stephanie, the perfect all-American couple. The caption read, "The Daniels family, a legacy of courage and service, so proud of our heroes." I wasn't in the picture. It wasn't just that I was absent, it was the calculated perfection of the frame, the deliberate composition that left no space for me, no hint that another child, another story, even existed. I was not just missing. I had been surgically, expertly, and publicly removed. Then, against every self-preservation instinct, I read the comments. Dozens of them, from old family friends, from distant relatives. What a beautiful family! The perfect picture. And then, the one that shattered the last of my composure. From my Aunt Carol, my mother's own sister. So wonderful to see you all together. All together. That was it. That was the final breaking blow. This wasn't a rejection anymore. It was a public declaration of my non-existence. The years of quiet dismissals, the Thanksgiving insults, the living will, the empty chair at my graduation, they all coalesced into this one, single, brutal act of public erasure. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades finally erupted. It wasn't a hot, screaming rage. It was a cold, silent, and absolute fury that clarified everything. I stood up from my bed, my movements precise. I walked into the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The face looking back wasn't the hurt little girl anymore. It wasn't the daughter desperate for a scrap of approval. The eyes were hard. The jaw was set. I saw a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. I remembered Brené Brown's words about stepping into the arena. I remembered General Marshall's voice. Your battlefield doesn't have bullets or bombs, but it is no less critical. I thought of a book on leadership I'd been reading, Radical Candor by Kim Scott. It argued that true kindness wasn't avoiding conflict to spare feelings. That was just ruinous empathy, the very poison I had been swallowing my whole life to keep a false peace. True strength was challenging directly, speaking the truth, even when it was hard. They had thrown down the gauntlet. They had declared war on my very existence. I was done running. I was done being silent. I would go to Fort Bragg. I would walk onto their stage, in their world, and I would let the truth, in all its uncomfortable glory, speak for itself. My hands were perfectly steady as I picked up my phone. There was no hesitation. I dialed the number for General Marshall's aide-de-camp. "Major, this is Lieutenant Colonel Daniels," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, a voice accustomed to giving commands, a voice they had never heard. "Please inform the general that I would be honored to accept the Air Force Cross at the ceremony. I confirm my attendance." As I hung up, a sense of profound, terrifying calm washed over me. The decision was made. The die was cast. They wanted to erase me from their story. Fine, I would just have to write my own. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where the pain became so great, it turned into fuel? That one final straw that broke not your back, but your silence. Tell me about your breaking point in the comments below, because in the next chapter, we're going to see what happens when silent strength finally decides to make a very, very loud noise. A confirmation is not a plan. A decision is not a strategy. The moment I hung up the phone, the cold fury that had propelled me forward solidified into something else: tactical focus. I would not walk into Fort Bragg armed with nothing but righteous anger. Anger was a fuel, not a weapon. This was not a family squabble anymore. It was an operation, and I would prepare for it as such. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meticulous preparation. My first call was to General Marshall's office. I requested and received an unclassified executive summary of Operation Silent Sentry. The key objectives, the outcomes, the impact on national security. I memorized it, internalizing the language I would need, ensuring every word I might speak would be precise and irrefutable. My second step was more painful. I dove into the digital archives of my own life, opening old emails and text messages I had long since buried. I wasn't looking to reopen wounds, but to gather intelligence. I scrolled through years of one-sided communication. The email from my father congratulating Jason on a promotion, with a curt PS to me asking if I was still happy with that desk job. The text from my mother on my 30th birthday, not asking about me, but lamenting my lack of a husband. The condescending messages from Jason about real soldiers versus support staff. Each message was a piece of evidence, a confirmation of the long, systematic campaign of dismissal. I compiled them not in a spirit of revenge, but with the cold detachment of an analyst building a case file. Each painful memory became a round of ammunition, not to attack, but to defend the truth of my experience. This wasn't about payback. It was about an after-action review of my own life. The night before my flight to North Carolina, the weight of it all finally hit me. The strategic calm evaporated, leaving behind a raw human fear. I found Mark in the small outdoor patio area of our complex, nursing a beer under the vast, star-dusted Texas sky. He listened silently as I paced, the words tumbling out of me. "I'm scared," I finally admitted, the confession feeling like a betrayal of the strong front I had built. "I'm terrified that I'll get up on that stage, with the medal and the uniform and all of it, and they still won't see me. They'll look right through me, just like they always have. What if nothing changes?" Mark didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell me I was strong or that it would be okay. He just took a slow sip of his beer and looked at me, his expression serious. "Erica," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "you're not doing this for them. You're not trying to change their minds. You can't. You're doing this for the 17-year-old girl who got her Air Force scholarship dismissed over Thanksgiving dinner. You're doing this for the high school valedictorian who stared at an empty chair. You owe it to her to show up." His words landed with the force of a revelation. He was right. This wasn't about them anymore. It wasn't about forcing them to see me. It was about me finally seeing myself. It was an act of liberation, a final definitive answer to the ghosts of my past. I felt the fear recede, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. The next day, in a sterile hotel room in Fayetteville, just miles from the house I grew up in, I began the final stage of my preparation. I unzipped the garment bag and carefully laid out my Air Force dress uniform. The service dress coat was a deep, formal blue, a stark contrast to the army green that had dominated my entire childhood. It was the color of a different sky, a different world, my world. I laid out the rows of ribbons I had earned in silence, each one representing a mission, a success, a sacrifice they knew nothing about. The Air Force Commendation Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, and others with decorations I couldn't even name for them. With meticulous precision, I began to assemble my armor. I pinned the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel onto my shoulders. I aligned the ribbons over my heart. Each pinprick through the fabric was a deliberate act, an affirmation. This is what I did. This is who I am. Finally, I stood before the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the invisible daughter. She was not the distant cousin. She was a field-grade officer, a commander, a strategist. The uniform didn't feel like a costume. It felt like a second skin, one I had earned through a decade of silent, relentless work. There was no trace of fear left in my eyes, only a calm, unwavering focus. I was ready. I reached for the simple civilian jacket I had brought, slipping it on over my uniform, concealing my rank and my story one last time. It was time to go to the ceremony. It was time for the operation to begin. The operation had begun. I walked through the doors of the auditorium at Fort Bragg, the civilian jacket a shroud over my armor. An aide discreetly led me to my seat in the front row, the VIP section reserved for high-ranking guests. It was directly across the aisle from my family. I settled into my chair, my back straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I could feel their eyes on me. I didn't look back. The first phase of any operation is observation. From my vantage point, I saw the play unfold exactly as I knew it would. I saw Jason's brow furrow in confusion as a 2-star Army general stopped by my seat to shake my hand and murmur, "An honor to finally meet you, Colonel." I saw my father lean over and whisper to my mother, his expression a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. My mother just looked bewildered, her polite socialite smile frozen in place. They were trying to solve a puzzle, but they didn't have all the pieces, not yet. The ceremony began with the posting of the colors and the national anthem. The predictable rhythm of military pomp and circumstance was a calming force, allowing me to center myself. I watched as various soldiers received their commendations. Then came Jason's moment, Captain Jason Daniels. His name boomed through the hall. He strode to the stage with the easy confidence of a man who had never once had to question his place in the world. The citation for his Silver Star was read, detailing his genuine heroism under fire. I felt a flicker of sincere pride for him, an echo of a sister's love from a lifetime ago. He stepped to the microphone, his speech polished and heartfelt. He thanked his men. He thanked his commanding officers. Then he turned to our family. "I want to thank my father, retired Colonel William Daniels," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He is my hero, the man whose example I've tried to live up to every single day." My father's chest puffed out, his eyes glistening. "To my mother, Rachel, the strongest Army wife I've ever known." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "And to my beautiful wife, Stephanie, my rock and my anchor." His wife blew him a kiss. I waited. I knew it was foolish, but I waited for my name, for a single, cursory mention. And to my sister, Erica, it never came. The speech ended. The applause was thunderous. He was their hero, their legacy. I was nothing. I sat there perfectly still, a ghost at their feast of honor. The storm was coming. I was the storm. As the applause for Jason died down, General Marshall walked onto the stage. His presence commanded immediate, absolute silence. He stood at the podium, his 4-star rank radiating an authority that dwarfed everyone else in the room. "Before we conclude today's ceremony," he began, his voice filling the auditorium, "we have one final and most important recognition to present." A ripple of anticipation went through the crowd. An award after a silver star meant something significant. "There are those among us," General Marshall continued, his gaze sweeping across, "the rows of uniformed personnel whose greatest achievements must remain unknown, even to their own families. Heroes who operate in the shadows, whose sacrifices are made in silence." I felt my heart begin to hammer against my ribs. I kept my eyes fixed on the stage, but in my periphery, I could see my family shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't on their program. Today, General Marshall's voice rose with formal gravity. "With the declassification of a vital national security initiative, Operation Silent Sentry, we have the rare privilege of bringing one of those heroes into the light." He paused, a masterful orator letting the silence build. His eyes moved deliberately, finding my family in the front row, and then they found me. "It is my distinct honor to invite to the stage the architect and commanding officer of that operation, Lieutenant Colonel Erica Daniels." A gasp was audible from across the aisle. "Who?" I heard Jason hiss to my father. And then the room erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar of thunderous, instantaneous respect. Every single person in uniform, from the privates in the back to the generals in the front, shot to their feet in a cascading standing ovation. These were people who understood. They knew what Silent Sentry meant. They knew the stakes. They knew the lives saved. Only 3 people remained seated, frozen in a tableau of disbelief. My father, his mouth slightly agape, my mother clutching her purse with white-knuckled hands, and Jason, his face drained of all color, a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Time seemed to slow down. I stood. With deliberate, measured steps, I unbuttoned my civilian jacket. I let it fall from my shoulders onto the chair behind me, revealing the deep blue of my Air Force dress uniform. The rows of ribbons on my chest, the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel on my shoulders, all seemed to catch the stage lights at once. I walked towards the stage. Each step was solid, unwavering. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, but I was only aware of 3. I saw the confusion on my father's face morph into a dawning, horrified recognition. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth. I saw Jason's hero-like composure completely shatter, replaced by the bewildered stare of a boy who just discovered the world wasn't flat. On stage, General Marshall waited, his expression one of profound pride. He recounted my career, my promotions, my leadership of Silent Sentry, the complex cyber operation that dismantled a global terrorist network without a single American casualty. With each word, I could feel the foundation of my family's world cracking beneath them. Finally, he opened a small velvet-lined case. Inside lay the Air Force Cross. As he pinned the nation's second highest award for valor onto my uniform, he leaned in and whispered, for my ears only, "Long overdue, Colonel, long overdue." Then it was my turn. I stepped to the microphone, the entire auditorium silent and waiting. I looked out, not at the crowd, but directly across the aisle. I found my father's eyes, then my mother's, then Jason's. I spoke, my voice clear and cold, carrying to every corner of the hall. "There are, indeed, battles that are not fought on a battlefield," I said. "But the sacrifice is the same. I accept this honor not for myself, but for all who serve in the shadows, for those whose contributions are measured in the disasters that never happened." I paused, letting my gaze linger on my family. And for those who, perhaps, will never be fully understood, even by the ones they fight to protect. I held their gaze for a long, unbroken moment. The applause that followed was deafening, but I barely heard it. All I could see were their faces, frozen in the wreckage of the reality I had just detonated. The operation was a success. As I stepped down from the stage, the thunderous applause felt like a distant, muffled roar. My focus was singular, zeroed in on the 3 frozen figures across the aisle. General Marshall met me at the bottom of the steps, his eyes conveying a universe of understanding. He gave a subtle nod to an aide who swiftly approached my family as they were being swarmed by confused well-wishers and curious colleagues. The general has arranged a private room for the Daniels family to debrief, the aide announced with quiet authority, parting the sea of people. The walk to that small, sterile conference room was the longest of my life. I led the way, my back straight, my steps measured. I could hear their hesitant footsteps behind me, a discordant rhythm of shock and shame. The aide closed the door behind us, and the sudden silence was deafening, a vacuum where years of unspoken truths now screamed for air. Jason was the first to break. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sputtering, incredulous rage. "Why?" he stammered, his face a blotchy red. "Why would you do that, Erica? Why would you hijack my day and turn it into this?" I turned to face him, my gaze as cold and steady as the steel of a weapon. There was no anger in my voice, only the flat, hard tone of fact. "Your day," I repeated softly. "Let's be clear, Jason. You deleted my name from the guest list. You publicly disowned me, calling me a distant cousin. You made this day what it is. I am simply providing the context you conveniently omitted." My father, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen him, stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. "Erica, honey, a general, an Air Force cross. We didn't know." "No," I cut him off, my voice sharp for the first time. "You didn't want to know, because knowing would have forced you to admit that the world is bigger than the Army. It would have forced you to acknowledge that your daughter, the one who chose the desk job, was fighting battles you couldn't even imagine. And it would have meant that your golden boy, your perfect legacy, wasn't the only hero in the family, and you couldn't handle that." His face crumpled, the truth of my words striking him with the force of a physical blow. He sank into one of the conference room chairs, utterly defeated. That's when my mother began to cry. Not silent, dignified tears, but wrenching, theatrical sobs. She rushed forward, reaching for my hands, her touch now desperate instead of dismissive. "I'm so sorry, baby," she wept. "We were wrong. I was so wrong. Please, can you forgive your mother?" For a moment, the old conditioning kicked in. The instinct to comfort, to soothe, to make it all okay. But I looked down at her hands holding mine, and I felt nothing but a profound, weary distance. I gently pulled my hands away. "I accept your apology, Mom," I said, and the exhaustion in my voice was real. There was no triumph, no satisfaction. But an apology can't erase 15 years of being made to feel worthless. It can't unring the bells of every dismissive comment, every forgotten milestone, every deliberate slight. I can't go back to being the daughter who quietly waits for a scrap of your approval. That person, she doesn't exist anymore. You killed her. The rawness of my words silenced her sobs. She stared at me, her mouth open as if seeing a stranger for the first time. It was Jason, his anger now replaced by a desperate confusion, who finally asked the question that hung in the air. "So what now, Erica? What do we do now?" I looked at the 3 of them, my shell-shocked brother, my broken father, my stunned mother. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking up at them, seeking their approval. I was looking at them as equals, or perhaps, for the first time, from a position of strength. I was the one setting the terms of engagement. "Now," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding, "we begin again, or we don't. But if we do, it will be on my terms. There will be no more condescension, no more dismissals, no more manipulation. You will respect me, you will respect my uniform, and you will respect my service as equal to your own. You will see me for who I am, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force, or I let the weight of the final words settle in the suffocating silence. You will not see me at all." I looked at each of them one last time, engraving their shocked faces into my memory. This was the true moment of victory. Not the medal, not the applause, but this, the drawing of a line in the sand that could never be undrawn. "The choice," I concluded, "is yours." Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on them. I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway, leaving them behind in the sterile room with the ruins of their own making. The sounds of the reception were a distant murmur. I didn't look back to see if they would follow. I already knew they wouldn't, not yet. I walked past the curious stairs, my head held high, my steps sure and even. I was walking away from the battle, but for the first time I felt like I had finally won the war. 6 months passed in silence. After that day at Fort Bragg, I flew back to Texas and waited, not for an apology, but for a response to the choice I had given them. The silence was their answer. In the beginning, it was a hollow ache, the phantom limb of a family that was no longer there. But as the weeks turned into months, the ache slowly transformed into a quiet, clean space. I was no longer living in anticipation of the next disappointment. I was free. One crisp Sunday morning, I was running along the San Antonio River Walk, the cypress trees lining the banks, creating a dappled shade on the stone path. I had a podcast playing in my earbuds, a sermon by Bishop T.D. Jakes. As I ran, his powerful voice boomed with a message that seemed written just for me. "Sometimes," he declared, "people have to be removed from your life so God can promote you. The subtraction is for the addition. You have to be willing to let go of what was, to embrace what will be." I stopped running, leaning against the railing overlooking the gentle current. The words washed over me, a profound spiritual confirmation. The subtraction is for the addition. My loss wasn't a punishment, it was a pruning. It was the universe clearing out the dead wood to make room for new growth. The pain of the separation was real, but for the first time, I saw it not as a wound, but as a gift. The gift of an empty space, waiting to be filled with something true. That afternoon, I went to a hardware store. I bought a simple plank of reclaimed pine wood and some brackets. Back in my apartment, I measured, drilled, and mounted a single sturdy shelf on the wall of my living room. It was the wall where, in my childhood home, my father's medals and my brother's trophies had hung. But this shelf would tell a different story. I didn't place the Air Force Cross there. That medal was a symbol of a public battle, and it belonged in its formal case. This shelf was for my private victories. I placed 3 items on it. First, a framed photo of my team from Silent Sentry, taken after a grueling 72-hour operation. We were all exhausted, smiling, huddled together around a computer screen, my chosen family. Next to it, I placed my dog-eared copy of Brené Brown's Daring Greatly, the book whose words had been a lifeline in my darkest hour. And finally, I added a small, smooth gray stone that I had picked up from the bank of the river that morning. A simple reminder of the peace I had found right here in Texas. This was my legacy. It wasn't built on bloodlines or inherited glory. It was built on resilience, on knowledge, and on the quiet strength of chosen connections. It was a legacy I had forged myself in the fires I had walked through alone. A few nights later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. Team is heading out for celebratory beers. We finally cracked the Phoenix cipher. You in? A genuine smile spread across my face, easy and unforced. The kind of smile that reaches your eyes. For years, my life had been defined by what I wasn't. I wasn't the right kind of daughter, the right kind of sister, the right kind of soldier in their eyes. But here, with these people, I was just Erica, and that was more than enough. I texted back, "On my way." As I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, a sense of profound lightness settled over me. The war with my family was over, not with a truce, but with a quiet armistice I had declared for myself. The battle to build a life of joy, meaning, and authentic connection, however, was just beginning. And as I stepped out into the warm Texas night, I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that this time I was not going into it alone. My story with my biological family might have ended in silence, but my new life has just begun to find its voice. The biggest lesson I've learned is that your true legacy isn't what you're born into, but the life you have the courage to build for yourself. It's about finding your chosen family, the people who see you, support you, and celebrate you for exactly who you are. Who is your chosen family? Who are the people who have stood by you? Tag them in the comments below to honor them. If my story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone and that they have the strength to write their own story. Thank you for listening.